What is it, March 11th meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission to order. First item on the agenda is public comment. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak on a topic which we have not heard or not scheduled to hear? All right, then we'll move on to agenda item 2, the eWeb Riverfront Master Plan.
Excuse me?
Thank you.
How's that for an intro?
Deliberations and actions. So where we ended up last week, folks, was on parking. We got through half of the discussion. I think we've got about half a dozen more items for members of the commission to discuss, and with our goal today to take action, a recommendation on the whole bundle of planning actions, actually 5 of them altogether. And Commissioner Duncan has just notified us he needs to leave by 1 p.m., so if that makes any difference in our discussions, might consider that. So, Gabe, we left off with Commissioner Baker's discussion of minimum number of off-street parking spaces, and we were leaning heavily, some more heavily than others, to recommending a change from 0.5 parking spaces per dwelling unit, boosting that to 0.75. And now we'll move on to the maximum number of off-street parking spaces. And Commissioner Jaworski, you have a couple of recommendations there. So if you want to present your case, and then we'll hear from Gabe to hear the planning team's proposal, and then we'll take a straw vote. How's that sound? Okay?
Yes, I looked at the maximum, and I'm referring to page 21 in the table of 9.3165. Basically, what it is calling for is 2.25 for residential and 250 per square foot, 1 parking space for non-residential. When I took a look at the acreage that's involved in this particular site and what's dedicated to eWeb keeping in certain buildings and the amount that's open for open space, I took a look at that and tried to ascertain what might be the potentials for actual buildings being built in square footage. And I came to the conclusion that's an awful lot of parking. I went and looked at several parking areas, and usually it takes almost 2 acres to put about 130 or 25 cars. And if we were looking at just non-residential being 100,000 square feet, there's a potential, there for 400 parking places. So I was kind of feeling that this created a potential problem for me, and that it would take up a lot of the land for parking, and at the same time raise the issue of a parking structure being on that particular site that might address this, but I don't know if that was in the plans or not. I recommended that it be reduced to 1.25 for non-residential and 1 parking space for every 1,000 square feet. But if there is going to be a parking structure required on this particular site, then that might not be an issue.
Was there some logic as to how you got to 1.25 and 1 per 1,000 feet?
I took a look at some other developments and what the codes are for them, let's say in a nodal development area or something, and what they're allowed as per parking for a maximum. And I kind of figured, well, if it's working there, it might work here, because this is supposed to be a high-density project.
Gabe, response before I go around to the commission?
Sure. I think one important clarification is that the code proposes a limit on the number of new surface parking spaces to 6. And so we would expect that for substantial projects that aren't relying, for example, on interim parking areas, as we've discussed, that for the most part that'll be provided within structures or courtyards that are sort of to the interior of blocks and away from the street. So we do expect structured parking in the long term, overall, to try to accommodate that need. The code really, I think, pushes it in that direction with the limit on new surface spaces. In terms of a comparable example, I would point out that the Walnut Station zoning has a similar maximum of 2.25 The limit of 1.25 would cause some concern in the case of residential uses that might want to provide more than the minimum. But it's I think important also to clarify that residential uses typically in our code currently do not have a maximum.
You referenced Walnut Station for residential. What about the non-residential, one per 250 square feet? Is that in Walnut?
It's a yeah, that is consistent with Walnut Station, so I understand it.
Comments from the commission, Jeff?
I just want to make sure I understood, John was talking about the non-residential maximum allowed?
And the residential, yes.
Okay.
The residential, to me, also suggested that 2.25, apparently Gabe has said this is fairly standard. I just didn't think that we wanted to have, that's looking toward what maybe student housing would have, and I didn't think this particular project was moving in that direction for a need for so much parking spaces per unit.
Steve?
I just wanted to point out that if you consider this housing in terms of accessibility to the university, it's highly accessible. It's right on the bike path. Essentially, you go from here onto the bike path to the university without having to go through town. So, in some ways, this is, in a way, is more accessible than Capstone.
Yeah.
In terms of student housing. So it wouldn't be an issue about limiting the maximum housing, but if some developer, and we don't have any control over, decides to put in residential housing and target it more to students and have 4-bedroom units, 4 to 5 bedroom units, which are allowed by the code, which we see typically a lot of still 4-bedroom units in the Western University, then it might make sense to have the developer have the flexibility to have more parking, more parking than 1.25. Just, again, that's what they're targeting. It's not that students will use the car to drive to university, but they'll use it to drive to the airport, to go major shopping trips, or to the coast or the mountains. So it's more of storing the car.
Other comments?
John, then I'll go.
I don't have a problem with the maximum if there's going to be structured parking and somehow it was mandated that this would occur. If it's not going to occur, I have a really difficult time, even though Gabe suggested interim spaces within the buildings would be able to accommodate that. I don't think there's enough acreage to accommodate that, and that's what my problem is that we just don't end up having a few buildings with a lot of parking areas. So if someone feels that's wrong, that they could build these buildings 4+ stories high and accommodate it with on-site parking, I don't have a problem, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to have structured parking. And if I feel that way, what's telling me is that then there should be something that recommends that there be structured parking, not it may happen.
Yeah, this one was one that I kind of worked through and thought about a lot, because I always have a concern when we try to put parking on each building site, as Commissioner Jaworski commented, if there's truly going to be a common structured parking that could be utilized. I mean, you see that in a lot of more dense markets. If you build some sort of structured parking within a structure, you don't convert that very easily at some point later on because other parking shows up. So I have some concern, not so much with a residential change. I would have probably said something less than 2.25, but maybe not 1.25. The resident or the non-residential is where I have a concern, because if you're a small office unit user, 1 per 1,000 or 2 per 1,000 may be sufficient, but if you're a higher type of user, there tends to be a need for more on-site parking unless there's adequate parking around. Certainly if we've got this overflow temporary parking until someone builds on it, but as they build on it, then it disappears. So you sort of run into that kind of catch-22 in mind. If everyone's counting on the interim parking during their development, during the early phases, and then what happens when that parking disappears? Does all of a sudden we stop seeing development occur, because then there's this concern we don't have adequate parking. So I don't know that I have an answer, but I'd like to maybe hear from staff a little bit more, kind of the workings on sort of what they foresee parking to occur down there as we sort of phase through development, and if we get to a point where it's totally built out, where's the parking, and should it be embedded in every individual structure, which is not typically non or very low revenue generating on a per square foot basis versus fully developed facilities?
Sure. I think that the proposal that the applicants included in the code is intentionally flexible to try to allow any number of redevelopment scenarios and the sort of phasing that we can't really predict to occur over time. A key part of that strategy is the interim parking, the allowance to use those selected areas without requiring expensive upgrades for parking lot, landscaping, and whatnot, with a combination of pretty ample on-street parking through the street system, and also the minimums for development on each site. I think those all sort of combine to create a package that it really intends to, to some extent, to let the market drive the need, but to make sure that it's provided. Another piece of flexibility that we haven't discussed that's embedded in the code is the allowance that a development site can rely on parking with a lease agreement anywhere within the eWeb development site and within a quarter mile of that site. So it's more generous than our existing provision for shared parking through a lease agreement. So there are any number of ways that parking can be provided, and it's more flexible than we've seen in some of our other zones.
Okay, thanks.
Steve, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, if you look at Western University, obviously not a project that goes on a single lot, like a 12,000 square foot lot, sometimes 7,000. But if you look, you can see examples in our neighborhood where they did underground parking. Behind the park, there were two small lots that were assembled. It was below-grade parking structure. Tenants like it, the manager likes it because they're providing parking. If there were excess, they would rent it out, but there generally isn't. And then you have the Pearl, which is done in a commercial area, but it's essentially there's a small amount of commercial on the lower floor, and mostly it's all housing. It's got a underground parking below it as well. So I would suspect that if you assembled a little bit bigger, two lots, more, that you end up in a situation where you could have underground for residential purposes. And I know that there were several other projects that were planned in my neighborhood that had underground parking as part of them. They just haven't been built because it's some other development region. It was commercial and the tenant refused to, break the lease, so it wasn't worth it at the time. And they didn't have any concern. In fact, there was one project where they were planning on building 2 floors of underground parking because they assumed that they could rent the extra spaces out. And I think that would be the case if in a residential structure you overcompensated or you planned to have a little extra, you would find willing buyers to rent those spaces who wanted protected parking. That was so I would be a little reluctant to limit the residential maximum. The non-residential, obviously, it's more likely that you'll get people to share non-residential parking. Residential parking, people like to have it close by because, they're dragging groceries and whatever. So it's like, why do we have carports right attached to our houses? In the old days, they used to be separate. We decided we didn't want to walk.
John?
Well, I think the place where we ought to be a little more restrictive is setting the minimum rather than the maximum. I trust the wisdom of the planners who came forward with this and the market to not build. I'm not totally comfortable, but I'm willing to trust that they won't build any more than they need. But, unless we reduce the minimum, I don't see this makes a whole lot of difference, and I'll trust what we got.
Any other comments? Let's take this into two pieces. And let me see a show of hands who would support John's proposal to reduce the residential allocation from 2.25 to 1.25. All in favor of that, raise your hand.
I got it.
Okay, then, just to confirm, all those in favor of remaining at the 2.25, raise your hand. Looks like we're staying with that one. Let's skip on down to the non-residential. All those in favor of John's proposal to require one parking space per 1,000 square feet, raise your hand.
As a maximum.
Yeah, this is maximum, yeah. All those in favor of staying at the one per 250 square feet, raise your hand. Okay. So no change, Kate.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a comment. I hope this moves forward because I'm supportive of this project, and I hope that in the future we don't have a parking issue, or I'll be there. And I just want to say that, and I heard what Commissioner Baker has said, but when I've talked to some individuals about underground parking, they were telling me it's 20,000 plus or minus per space. So if you wanted to spend 850,000 plus, you'd have enough for 42 spaces, or according to that, maybe 18 residential units, or not very much, 40,000 square feet of whatever, non-residential. So I don't really see this happening, because what I've been hearing is development costs, you know, they want to try to keep it down, but that's just a closing comment.
Appreciate that. Well, let's move on to the next one, Steve. We're pretty well settled with that. And this is, Steve, your proposals to make modifications to Table 9.3165 Sub 3, the bicycle parking requirements. You want to walk us through your proposal, please?
Sure. So my concern here is we keep talking about trying to incentivize pedestrians and bicycles, but when it comes to residential, we don't provide adequate bicycle parking. So our current code provides one parking space per residence. That's assuming one person lives in, the maximum of one person lives in a residence, in a way, or, you know. Again, these are going to be, from my point of view, fairly attractive locations. It's very close to the university, easy to commute to the university, easy to walk downtown. We're trying to get people to not use their cars. They might have a car to go out to the airport because there's not much choice here. They're close to the mountains, but we'd like for them to use alternate transportation to get around town. But we don't provide a code that sets a reasonable minimum for the amount of parking spaces for residential. So my suggestion is we boost that up. Really, I think it should be 2, but I think a more reasonable compromise would be 1.5. In other words, maybe there's some elderly that don't bicycle, but they might have tricycles, which require even bigger space, or, you know, a young family with a child that needs a child carrier, which also takes a bigger space. Our code just sets it to the minimum size of a bicycle. So my proposal is to boost the minimum number to 1.5, and also realizing that people have visitors that come on bicycle to visit them. And so we need to provide some short-term parking at these residential places for people that come to visit. So change the percentage of parking, so 10% is short-term.
Gabe, response?
I'm sorry, 10% short-term?
Yeah. So the rest of it would be long-term. It's
Oh.
just- And I just made up that number. It's not, just so that there would be some small amount of short-term parking at the facility
Got ya.
for some visits.
The planning team's thoughts, Gabe?
I think Commissioner Baker pointed out that the current requirements for one per dwelling unit, that's consistent with Walnut Station and across other, multifamily uses in other zones. It doesn't particularly concern staff to raise that amount. If we do end up changing this, I think staff would be supportive of providing at least a certain percentage in short term for convenience for visitors and the like. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Comments from the commission? Bill?
I think I would agree with that as far as bumping that up a little bit. And I think with the short term too, I'm trying to remember in the code, we have, and maybe I'm thinking commercial code, where we have a specified minimum number of parking spaces, and maybe that's 4 for commercial. Maybe that's what I was referring to. But I think Steve makes a good point as far as visitors to residential areas and residential projects having some short-term parking. So whatever that percentage might settle out at, I think I'd be supportive of that.
John?
Yeah, I just had a question of staff. I'm not as familiar as I should be with Walnut Station, but it's been referenced for parking and now referenced again for bicycle units. Do I assume then that Walnut Station is a success and there are no issues with A, parking, or B, bicycle parking?
So a few examples that I can think of, actually development occurring around the arena and within the Walnut Station area actually preceded the code adoption for that. I don't think that we have a lot of tried and true examples in terms of testing that code. But I do know, for example, around the arena and for those projects, we've worked closely with our transportation planning folks and looked at options for providing more and more convenient bike parking as well as vehicular parking given the concerns in the neighborhood. So it's not so much a code-driven outcome as it is one that, that the city's concerned about and wants to contribute to.
I think the long and the short of it is there was significant planning involvement, particularly in this case with an existing neighborhood, correct, Dave?
That's right.
That's where they landed with it. And so that whole process was in essence carried forward into the EWEB proposal.
It was, although I think a distinct difference here is the proximity to an existing neighborhood, existing residential area where this is not,
Right. Walnut
was.
There was a lot of input from local business people in that area, as I recall. That was
Right.
I support the proposal. I think we need to encourage more bike use, especially when it's right on the premier bike path.
I'd support Commissioner Baker's recommendations for both raising the minimum and adding the short term.
Rick?
I can support the recommendation. When it comes, I guess a comment, when it comes to short term, if you're going to have, again, a really dense area of a lot of housing and business and everything else, it would seem to me that one of the common elements that ought to be developed is short-term biking to be used by a number of properties. Not every property have to have their own, particularly for the non-residential, but that's not in the proposal, so it would seem to me that would have been a better solution here.
Steve, since you admittedly just kind of pulled the 90%, 10% out of the air, would you be comfortable in, assuming that this goes in the direction it appears to be going, putting that back to the consultants and have them work some sort of a percentage out?
Yeah, I just pulled that number out of the air.
Okay.
So.
Any other comments? Bill?
I think just to tag on to what Rick just said, I've noticed the Beam building out here, even though downtown hasn't fully developed yet, the short-term parking in front of that is relatively substantial and often full, or close to full. So,
Probably for other buildings, though.
well, but I think that tags on to your comment as far as having some sort of common short-term parking in the area.
That kind of brings up, we have this allowance that for residential, you can, correct me if I'm wrong, where I'm wrong here, great, Gabe, where you can work out lease arrangements for other spaces for cars. Is that correct? Could there be, and I'm just throwing it out there, should there be some other kind of arrangement that would provide a similar for bikes?
I think there could be. One other thing I might suggest in terms of seeking the consultant's input, and from experience with several downtown projects, one of the things I think might be valuable is to allow the minimum bike parking to be counted within the right-of-way. That can often be a constraint in the downtown area, and I think we see some successful examples where that really that land area is limited, and where we have buildings right up to the right-of-way, it would open up some opportunities there to provide bike parking, whereas our code doesn't currently allow counting those spaces within the right-of-way.
Yeah, I would be supportive of that. Didn't we actually do that in the West University area when we made some changes? We allowed short-term to be in right-of-ways? I seem to remember we talked about the areas between streets and sidewalks as being allowable.
I don't believe so. There might have been conversation about it, but I'm not aware that we've made a formal code change there.
Yeah, I don't
That-
recall
that-
a code change.
I mean, typically, it's been a situation where we might recognize the demand in the midst of a building permit review. We might allow it with a revocable permit, but it's sort of above and beyond what the minimum code requirement is in order to provide that convenient access. So this would allow them to actually count toward their minimums.
Yeah, I would be supportive of that, because again, I think that particularly if you're going into a dense, non-residential area, you park your bike, you walk around, you do several things. You don't move your bike every time you want to go to a different store. And it would seem to me, again, to be a nice common element that actually could even be done in the open space. Again, if you expect it to be sort of an active open space, people need places to put their bikes. So I would be happy if we did it in such a way that if there was space is developed in the common area or the open space, that it could also be somehow prorated to to buildings that were constructed.
Okay, so just to make this, Steve?
Yeah, the only thing that I wanted to mention, I was thinking that it might make sense to think about sharing short-term parking between adjacent properties. It would make sense. But some of this discussion about parking in the right-of-way, you want long-term bicycle parking to be secure. And I can't see that happens in the right-of-way.
And-
They're talking short-term?
And to clarify, I only meant that to apply to short-term. If we're going to change the percentage to allow that, or require a certain portion of it to be short-term, we want to allow that in the right-of-way.
Just wanted,
Okay.
it wasn't stated, so I just wanted
So
to...
just
Yeah,
for
yeah.
clarification, then let's break this into two parts. And first, see a show of hands who supports Steve's recommendation that we change the minimum number of bicycle spaces per dwelling from 1 to 1.5.
Dwelling unit. He said dwelling, but it's dwelling unit.
Oh, is it? Okay, well, it's written as dwelling on the chart.
Same thing.
Okay.
Okay. All in favor of that, raise your hands. Okay. Then the second part of it is to reconfigure the 100% long-term parking requirement to include some percentage of short-term parking, be that on the property or common property area or right-of-way, but let the consultants take a second look at that. All in favor of that proposal, raise your hand. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Moving on down that same page 22 to the zone landscape requirements. Commissioner Jaworski, subsection 3, you had an issue or proposal for us.
Yes, I took a look at this. I actually discussed this somewhat with staff, and I guess this would also apply potentially around parking areas, let's say, as well. And I just couldn't see a 30 to 42 inch solid wall, which it might be 6 or 7 inches thick, taking the place of shrubs and trees to provide a buffer. Also, when you have shrubs and trees, your area there would then be several feet wide of a grassed area. In order to do that, rather than a potential walk and then all of a sudden this little wall and then your parking area. I also did a lot of walking around the area, and I didn't see many parking areas that had walls where I walked. And at the same time, when the trees and shrubs were out there, it made a big difference when you look at a parking area. The trees and shrubs really do a good job in buffering that from that. So from a visual perspective and what this area is supposed to look like, I felt that particular, let's just say, permitted allowance should be restricted and removed.
Gabe, planning group's response to that?
I would just point out that the existing code does allow for something similar in terms of a wall or berm between 30 and 42 inches, but it still requires the trees. In this case, the proposal is to exempt it from both trees and shrubs, but it still requires other plant material, which I would assume is the ground cover. It's also an adjustable standard under our code, and so you may be familiar with some examples around that that either pre-existed this current code or sought an adjustment. I think the key here, the intent was to allow for buffering to be provided in a more dense format, if you will, to still deal with the question of headlight glare and things like that. But given the limitation on the creation of new surface parking areas at 6, I think that to a large degree those issues be resolved through structured parking. But frankly, we wouldn't have too much concern in terms of striking this exemption. It would take up more land area.
Well, I looked at that and went back to the L2 screening standards, and the way I would read that is that the wall is the substitute for the shrubs, but then you
Right.
still need to have the planting and the trees, which is the ground cover, and that would still need to be between the sidewalk. It would need to be on the, if you did a wall as the substitution, the wall would have to be on the other side of that. It wouldn't allow you to put the ground cover and the trees behind the wall. The wall would have to be on the back side of that, if I'm...
That is correct.
Okay. So you'd still have from the sidewalk, you'd have some buffer of ground cover and trees before you got to the wall.
Right. Correct.
Yeah, you're saying that is correct, even though this reads as a substitute for required shrubs and trees specifically stated? You're saying that
Commissioner
those
Randall, as I understood it, was describing the existing code requirement, which requires the wall to be the farthest from the street, and so the landscaping is on the open side facing the street. Here, it doesn't specify. In the proposed code, it does not specify that requirement. And so I think that's something that could be changed or added as we talk about whether to strike the exemption or change it.
So,
Leave it at that.
we got Steve and then Jeff.
Well, Jeff, go, and then I'll...
I just want to make sure I understand the difference between what's prescribed here and the L2. Am I hearing that it's, the L2, did I understand you, Bill, that it does allow a wall instead of a shrub?
Yes, but it still requires the ground cover and the trees.
And this here, I'm seeing that it's, other plant material is still required as described in L2, so it sounds like they're just relieving you from the trees and shrubs.
trees. Correct.
So the difference between this and L2 is a tree, really.
And I think the location of the wall. I think you were saying, Gabe, that the wall in this proposal isn't specified.
Yeah.
Which side of that
And,
is.
and let me clarify further. As I look at the way this code is constructed, it does, under subsection 1, it requires one to comply with the standards at 9.6205 through 255. So really, I think it could be read that that the requirement for the wall to be farthest from the street is still applicable. It has to be read in context.
It might be helpful to clarify.
We could add that as a sentence to the exception to make it clear, so we're not bouncing back and forth.
Consistent
Yeah.
throughout.
I'm not quite getting why you can't have a tree there, though.
I think
Required to have a tree there. You could
it may have to do with width and the required area for the root zone.
Yeah, we've had some conflicts with this in my neighborhood. Essentially, this is a landscape buffer around surface parking. And I really think you can walk around my neighborhood, lots of places where there is no or inadequate separation. I really think we'd be better off if we just, agreeing with John, just make this back to the L2 standard. I don't think developers would have any problem with that. They're used to it. And if they want to put a wall, they can, if they want that level of privacy. But it guarantees that there's a certain separation by more than, just some bark mulch, right, which will, if the shrub doesn't live, all you end up with is bark mulch. So at least that there's some attempt to provide some visual separation, both for the cars not ending up over the sidewalk, but also so that the pedestrians feel, like they're not, car sticks out over the sidewalk and you're walking along with a cane. And
Gabe, I've got myself and then John. Are there specific circumstances that the planning team anticipated where trees were not going to work?
Not that I'm aware of.
John?
I support Commissioner Randall's proposal that we make it consistent with the rest of L2.
Okay. Rick?
Just to back up to make sure I understand, under the current L2, you're required to plant trees in these kind of buffers?
1 per 30 linear feet.
I guess I have, not knowing what development's going to occur there, we seem to be pushing things fairly close. Trees sometimes become problematic because they're really great when you first plant them, but they grow up and they break up sidewalks and all kinds of things. And I mean, there's a lot of places that you can wander around up in the Portland area where they have some really nice landscape buffers, sort of what I believe is described here, without the tree component, and they work really well. I'm fine with staying towards the current L2, but I think I'd like to see an exemption where trees would not be necessary because, again, we're sort of one size fits all, and we're trying to do this in truly an urban design environment, and sometimes it may just not work, at least to that level.
Bill?
And I think I agree as far as the trees go. I think my biggest concern is that in that buffer, that the landscape portion be toward the sidewalk and not toward the property, and that we don't have a wall as a substitute just right up against the sidewalk. I think that's a little more friendly and inviting. And I agree with Rick on the trees. I think we may have some areas that end up being narrow enough, and then the trees end up dying, or they don't grow well, or they break up the sidewalks and those sorts of things. And so I think having that flexibility, I'm fine with.
I've got myself and then Steve and then John. Is this exemption, does it appear in Walnut Station?
No. Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, because we have a lot of experience in our neighborhood, trees that are specified in these kind of are small trees. Sometimes they're really not much bigger than a shrub, than a tall shrub. So trees that tend to be specified in a case like this, because it's a narrow space to begin with, they aren't what we would normally consider street trees. Or considered ornamental. There are lots of choices that landscape architects have, and they just pick things that it's a little bit bigger than a shrub, maybe 8 feet or 10 feet higher, but that's what they use.
John?
And my impression is that our tree folks have gotten wise enough to know what trees heave sidewalks and which don't, and set standards for species that are less likely to heave. So I'd like to keep the trees in.
Gabe?
Just to clarify, the Walnut Station code does in fact have the same exemption. Just looked it up. Just looked it up. Yep.
John?
Muddies the waters.
Yeah, I keep looking at the street layout and the street map here, and we're supposed to have some buildings. I really didn't see this as being that big an issue, because I don't believe, if I was a developer, I was going to waste my street frontage with parking areas facing it. I thought at best it would just be an entranceway. And that's why I figured a nice entranceway with some trees would not hurt, rather than just having this walled-looking way to get into a parking lot that, according to staff earlier, is probably going to be all on the interiors of a lot of these spaces. So I didn't really see it as a big issue. I'm glad it's getting a lot of discussion, but I just didn't see someone wasting a lot of street frontage with putting a whole parking lot there. And I just thought that, like, again, this would be somewhat of the entrances to get to that behind the building, and therefore it should be, pretty nice, if anything, as an entrance and not a big deal.
Jeff?
I guess I'm leaning towards keeping the existing L2, keeping in mind, as John and Steve have said, that we're smarter about the trees we select in terms of size for the space that they're being put in. So I'd stick with the standard.
So if I understand things correctly, Gabe, if John's proposal is to eliminate the subsection 3, which in essence then would subject everything to the existing L2, is that a correct interpretation?
Yes.
Can I see it, John?
I guess I should clarify. I still like the idea of the wall. I just think it should be placed within the L2
And
standards.
L2 allows
All
that.
is allowed.
Okay, then I'm good.
That's what I was trying to clarify. If
Thank you.
strike 3, then it imposes the existing L2 standards. Steve?
I just want to make one other comment to just, I agree with what's been proposed by John and others, but usually where we see this is along the back, generally along the alleys, say, or the backside. And that you see this when it's next to another piece of property. So what you're doing is you're buffering the parking that would be next to a piece of property adjacent. So when, when you look out from one building, you don't see parking right on the property line. There's some landscape separation. So I think that, and I have to agree with John, this is probably not going to be used very much. If it is, it's probably going to be used in that case rather than, more than on the front, but who knows, depending on how the property gets subdivided. So again, I think that, just that clarifies to me what.
And for my purposes, I just like being consistent with Walnut Station, right or wrong, whatever. A lot of thought went into that. So let's go around the table. Those who are in favor of John's proposal to strike subsection 3 from 9.3170, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 opposed. 5 to 2, but we'll strike that one. Okay, skipping down to 9.3175, the open space requirements. John, you had a comment on that as well.
Yeah, this was under 2A. Basically, I didn't feel that just because it was 3 or fewer units that you should exempt this from any of the requirements of 1 and 2 above. I felt that they should all have an opportunity, whether you're in a 4-unit or a 3-unit, to have some open space.
Rick, I think you had a
Yeah,
comment.
I just had, yeah, you ready for me?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Gabe, your response to it? This came up a couple meetings ago.
Yeah, and just to clarify that currently, based on the definition of multifamily being 3 or more dwelling units, that 2 or I should say less than 3 units are exempt from the open space requirement. This would simply increase that exemption by 1 unit to encompass the smallest of our, what we would consider a multifamily project.
You want to finish with that issue and then go to mine?
Oh, I thought this
No,
was
mine's,
on the percentage.
well, yeah, it is. I mean, I can talk about that if you want. Okay, yeah?
Yeah.
A couple of, after I did this, remembering I was on vacation when I did it, I went back and I reread this and see that there's an exemption. I think there's a little conflict in the wording between 2 and 3. It talks about common open space, and then it's up to 50% of the required open space, and I'm assuming that means up to 50% of the required common open space. I'm looking for...
That's correct.
Okay. I think just adding the word common in there makes it a lot cleaner, because you sort of phrased the top one as common open space, and this one you've talked about open space, and I think there are some other requirements in there. It still seems to me, even an example that I put together somewhat fits, is if I'm understanding this correctly, if I have my 100,000 square feet of building on a 20,000 square foot lot, I'm still required to have 5,000 square feet of that lot as common open space. And that, I assume, means some type of outdoor common space Or does it mean, are we including lobbies and other elements like that in that discussion?
It could be interior common open space.
Now, is that common open space then not considered to be livable floor area, as talked about in the code? I'm trying to understand what numbers we're actually calculating in this equation to come up with what my requirements are for my open space, be it common or private. And I'm not sure that I get it, because I don't find livable floor area defined anywhere. Does that mean my bedrooms, my living room, my kitchen, my
Yeah.
bathroom? Does that mean the hallways and
Yeah.
any common collection areas and
What
so
we
on?
typically would base that on is the definition of floor area, and so it does allow for subtraction of, say,
Vertical spaces,
yeah,
elevators,
yeah,
stairwells.
mechanical
things like that.
space, other area that wouldn't be what we traditionally think of as living area within a unit.
But okay, you just said something different. But if I have common hallways that are 6 feet wide or 8 feet wide and run the whole length of the building,
Those
is
would
that
not-
livable?
Those would not count, is my understanding.
Would that count as common open space?
No.
You see where I'm going? The code to me is incredibly confusing as to what I calculate and how much I have to come up with.
Yeah.
Because if I go to one extreme, I end up having a lot of common space required that has to be accessible to, in my mind, that's anyone who wants to come into the building, access any parts of it. It's all that big common space. Or it has to be outside, which I'm concerned that these numbers really affect the developable portion of a site. And particularly given that we have 8 acres of open space in the eWeb project, plus we have 2 of our better parks that are within, literally right next door and right across the river with direct access. So I have a real concern to me that this one, I just had trouble understanding how do I get from A to B with regard to all these
Yeah.
measurements and everything else.
And I would just add that to a large extent, this relies on existing code in terms of the definitions and the allowance for certain areas that would be considered private, say balcony space and things like that. But the percentage is intentionally lower here, given the context, given the idea that there is a substantial amount of open space proposed along the riverfront park. So as compared to other zones, it's the percentage is less at 10% rather than, say, 20. So it's
Yeah.
trying to respond to that context, I think, the way it's proposed.
And if you look to development sites, hopefully we get somebody that wants to take down 2 or 3 acres to do different kinds of development on. It just seems to me that, again, I guess I'm looking more to make sure that this is very clear on how it's written so that people understand it. And as I went through this, it was unclear to me. And then I assume that somewhere it's been truth that the up to 50% could be in open spaces such as balconies, porches. Again, does that really, I don't expect you to tell me that, but does that really calculate out that somebody can develop a property that actually can achieve all of these? I know that we talk about Walnut Street Station as a model, but remember, we haven't seen anything built that I'm aware of at Walnut Street Station yet to proof that code yet either. So I'm concerned that I want to make sure this happens, and I want to make sure we don't have, and this may work real well, I can't get a feel for it by reading the code and looking to other code sections.
You got Jeff and Steve and Bill.
My only comment was, I think I read someplace else where duplexes are not allowed. So the 3 and fewer, how do you get fewer than 3 without single family, or, could it be part of the business
Well,
perhaps?
For example,
upstairs?
if you had a mixed-use building with
Yeah,
a
okay.
combination of office and retail and, say,
Sir, yeah.
two upstairs units,
Gotcha.
one option.
Yeah, in support of what John originally discussed, I don't think we need to lower it from 3 to 2. It seems, from 2 to, make it lower than it already is. If we've got code in there that's multifamily is 3 or more, I would be comfortable just with removing that A section. I also wanted to mention, we've regards to Rick's concerns are, the code on open space, it's got all kinds of examples of what you can use for common open space, you know.
Indoor recreation areas, for
Indoor
example.
recreation areas, you know, you can do roof decks or, you know, all kinds of things. So there are a lot of examples in the code that make it pretty clear. I wouldn't say that our code is the clearest it could be, but make it very clear that you can use all kinds of, you know, you could have you know, a courtyard, you know, or whatever,
Swimming pool.
swimming pools, all kinds of, you know, spa facility, whatever, you know, that would all qualify. The other thing I wanted to comment on is we have examples in my neighborhood. You know, when we removed the requirement for open space over a certain density, we did have a few, first of all, we had projects before that time that were built that actually they're still pretty much some of the highest density projects in our neighborhood that complied with the open space requirements, generally with, you know, courtyards in the center or some shared spaces indoors. But we had some after the fact, too, that decided not to push the envelope and go over the density requirement, or if they were close, they decided they would meet the open space anyway. Gordon Anslow did a couple of these, and generally, he didn't have any problem meeting the higher requirement in our neighborhood, even though they were dense projects. For example, I'll give you an example of one on High Street, right before 14th, between 13th and 14th, that has, you know, roof, you know, has porches off the units, and it has a small little courtyard that enhances one side of the building, you know, outdoor, but it's small, it's not very large, and it allowed him to save a big tree, or, you know, instead of planting them, you know. And so all I'm trying to demonstrate is developers have been meeting a much more stringent version of this code with fairly dense housing units. I'm talking about 50 units per acre in the R3 and 100 units per acre in the R4. That was before the code got changed. So, and some projects afterwards as well. So I don't think that the requirement is overly aggressive. If anything, we're being generous by reducing it from what we require in other places.
I just wanted to take a moment to loop back to Commissioner Duncan's comments, and I think to clarify, as I look at this more closely, that the existing code has a split. The overall percentage is referred to as required open space. And then within that, there's a percentage of common open space, and there's a percentage that's allowed in private open space, so that the term open space encompasses both. Here, the proposed code in the 10% standard under number 2 uses the phrase common open space. I think one simple clarification so that it operates consistently with current code would be to strike the word common. It makes it more clear to me that a portion of it can be common, a portion of it can be private. And we specify the up to 50% in private open space in the following section. So that, at least, I mean, it wouldn't intentionally change the balance, but it would make it more clear.
Fourth, Rick, and then I've got Bill and John in the lead. But you want to respond?
Well, yeah, I think that clarity is great, because then you're using the same terminology in 2 and 3. That makes sense to me, which is good. Should I wait? I want to just kind of respond to.
Yeah, I'll put you in the loop if
Okay.
you're responding.
Yep.
I've got Bill.
Well, and I think that clarification, Gabe, that you talked about, where you might have a multi-use development with maybe a walk-up apartment above a store or that sort of thing. I think my concern would be if we deleted the exemption under 2A, that we would then be, with subsection 3, we'd be painting ourselves into a corner where if someone did a small, let's say, commercial development with a single apartment up above or that they would still have to then provide common open space.
It wouldn't meet the definition of being multifamily. It would have to have 3 or more units. That existing definition won't change.
Okay, but you said there were times when you could have fewer than 3 units, because I know single-family and duplexes aren't allowed. So, again, when could we have...
Well, and in the case of less than 3 units, the code would not require, an existing code does not require common open space. So it's exempt. Two or less, three or less, 1 or 2 units.
Okay.
They don't have to
They don't have
provide common open space.
So just striking that word common would clarify that?
That's right.
Well, I'm supportive of requiring the open space, whether it's common or private, because clearly there are large areas in which for folks to gather, but it's not private, and it doesn't really work well for 6 months out of the year when it's raining if you want to have a reception or a party for your kids. So I support maintaining as much as possible. It's reasonable.
Back around to you, Rick.
Well, again, I think one of my concerns is I was thinking about large buildings. I mean, if we actually get somebody to come in and build on a 20,000 square foot lot, and they go 10 stories high, and they put a lot of livable space in there, I think what we've seen in the past, particularly around the university, is we're talking 3-story buildings with, even though there's been some high density and we've had some bigger ones, my concern is that does this become really difficult to achieve at a very high dense project? And I don't have a feel for that one way or the other. I mean, that's what I mean about truthing some of this. So, again, I'm not going to belabor the issue. I'll go with whatever people want to do. It's just, I have a concern that sometimes we put a multitude of parts of codes together without understanding how they work with each other, and does it start limiting some of the things that we might be able to achieve? I'm good with the rest of it.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example to Rick and the others. I think the Pearl, if you get a chance to do a tour sometime, it's an interesting building to look at, because on the south side, he built a large shared porch for the entire complex. I mean, there's a courtyard, too. I mean, there's other ways that he's met his open space, but he actually went to the trouble, the developer went to the trouble to build 2 covered open spaces on the south that look to the south with, I can't remember, there's light in there, so I can't remember if the roofs are covered. And then there's an open place between them, so you could, depending on the time of the year, you could actually sit in a nice big covered porch with friends, on an afternoon that's misty a little bit, and chat. And then if it's a nice day, there's a big area in between these 2 porches that, this is all level at the top level of the building, at the top floor, which is 4 stories, as I recall. So it's on the 4th floor with other units. That shows an example where an architect has taken the open space and really allowed him to do something very interesting that would be a real amenity to the tenants.
Gabe, just for mere clarification, if developments of 1 or 2 dwelling units are exempt, why was the 3 added?
I can't say precisely. There may, in fact, be a particular housing type, or it may be the size that the applicant was looking at. I can't pinpoint it based on my recollection, though.
Well, let's see where we go with this. Commissioner Jaworski's suggestion is for eliminating subparagraph A there of subsection 2, which would exempt developments of 3 or fewer dwelling units from the requirements of the open space. All in support of that, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. I'll go with that. 5. And just for clarification, are we all okay with deleting the word common in the common open space? Any problem with that? Okay, all right. Okay, page 23. Build 2 lines and setbacks. Steve, you had an issue with 2A, 1A, the 8-foot maximum?
Yeah. It seemed fairly restrictive in terms of a design to limit the residential setback to 8 feet while we allow 15 feet for the non-residential uses. You can just imagine that depending on the development, they want to I don't know, depending on the orientation, maybe you want to have some, outdoor seating area as part of the front of the building or whatever, that's along the street side, depending on the orientation of the building. You can picture from the plan drawing, that would be the block behind the residential, behind the restaurant zone. You can imagine that some of those, depending on the way things laid out in front of them, they might want to have a little more flexibility in terms of setback. And I just didn't see any reason to limit them to 8 feet when we allowed the commercial to be 15 feet. We still require that a certain amount of the setback be right on, much closer, but it just seemed to be limiting from a design standpoint and flexibility, for architects.
You say commercial, we allow for, 15 feet.
Yeah, they allow 15 feet for
Yeah.
commercial, but we allow 8 feet for
Gabe?
It's my understanding that the additional allowance to go back 15 feet, and again, that's only for 50% of the building, otherwise they have to pull it up to the street, to the build-to line. But that was intentional for more active sort of retail or outdoor seating areas for commercial uses, restaurants and the like. And I guess I would only suggest that if we do expand the maximum allowance for residential, that we'd have something similar in terms of a percentage, so that it only allows at least a part of the building to be recessed or set back that far. But I think that this was, it's very specific and intentional on the part of the design team in terms of the kind of intensity they wanted along the street.
Discussion?
It's hard to comment on that because in this one, you don't know if they're talking about a residential use which is a huge building, or a residential use which is some form of a townhouse or single dwelling, and therefore, do you walk up and have a flat door entrance, or do you have a stoop or a porch or whatever? If you're envisioning the latter of what I just said, then I think 8 feet is insufficient, and I agree with Commissioner Baker. But it's hard to say because I don't know if they're putting flush buildings here and they're not allowing any kind of either covered entrance or whatever to this building. And if so, more than 8 feet from that would make more sense. They do reference porches and things elsewhere, so I assume that some of these may have porches. I'm not sure.
Well, my feeling on this, again, I want to go with the planning team, and the logic that I see in this is, again, trying to maximize building area in terms of achieving density goals. And if you do 8 feet times any length of linear footage, cut that 50% and give it 15 feet, you're essentially averaging out the square footage of that open area in front of a building. So I think the only direction I would be willing to go is to match B and allow that 50% to the build-to line, but 15% setback, so that we're not using any more land than what's already allowed. Steve?
Yeah, no, I assume that we would continue to use the 50% limit setback.
For residential?
For residential as well. Because, again, my feeling is, depending on the orientation of the building, it might very well be that you want some outdoor area. Turns out, because of the orientation, it makes more sense for it to be on the street side rather than on the, what we might call the alley side, because there are some alleys planned. And so it just seemed to me to allow you greater flexibility to do that in residential. Otherwise, you're saying that the only place you can do it is sort of in the back.
Matching B, matching the non-residential requirement would mean that it wouldn't go right to the build-to line. There wouldn't be even a 3-foot setback, if that bothers you at all. John?
Yeah, 50% and all of that, I agree with, going up to the build-to line. I would think a developer and their architect, when they build this, and they say, well, we're a minimum of 3 and let's say a maximum of 15, they're not going to put the whole building back 15 and do what we're discussing here and say waste their development. They're going to minimize that, but at the same time, make it more agreeable to the eventual person who either buys or rents this unit. So I think that increasing the 8 feet to, let's say, 15 isn't going to cause a problem, because I don't think any developer is going to move the whole thing back 15 feet. But at least it provides that opportunity that if in a few occasions they do want to put a porch, that they don't put the porch that's only 1.5 feet wide and you can't even sit on it, or they make something that's at least decent.
Bill?
Or deep, excuse me, not
I
wide.
think I understand what Randy's saying on the 15 feet and 50%, but I guess I still go back to the original design team. I mean, this is, as you were saying, Gabe, this is a pretty specific requirement and that put on this, and not having been privy to, how the discussion got around to that, I'm a little concerned of just coming in and just changing it. I think I could support maybe changing the maximum 8 to 15 as long as we kept the minimum 3. But again, I think I'm inclined to leave it as is, and trust that they vetted this pretty well, because it is so specific.
And just to be clear, I didn't mention this, but this is an adjustable standard. It is something that can be, an alternate can be proposed through design review. So there is the opportunity, for example, with a specific plan, that a developer could request that additional width, or setback, I should say.
Well, we're talking about an allowable maximum, not a required minimum, so I also assume that a developer is going to maximize their building space in general, and therefore I don't see any problem with raising it to 15, because I don't think it'll be used much. But it gives an option for somebody who wants to.
Okay, well, let's see where this flies then. Those who support John Jaworski's recommendation to increase the maximum setback for...
Steve.
Oh, Steve's proposal.
okay.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm not taking it anymore.
Different
Thought
page,
Steve wanted to say something there, okay.
different page, it's okay.
To increase the maximum setback for residential uses from 8 feet to 15 feet. Raise your hand if you're in support of that. 1, 2, 3 opposed, 4, and I suppose you all are in favor of keeping it at 8 feet. Okay. So we'll keep that one at 8 feet. Building transparency, Steve, that's yours as well. You want to talk about VLT, visible light transmittance factors.
Yeah.
Go slow.
Sure. Let me back up just a second. Just on the last one, Commissioner Randall suggested maybe there's the other option, which we would pass it back to the design team for them to look at that particular issue. There's not.
Is there interest in doing that, or are we sticking with?
I wouldn't have, my problem with it is to take it back without understanding the genesis of it. So I could go back to that.
I'm with you, Randy. I think they've spent the time, and there's got to be thoughts, and
There's always the chance at the city council level too,
Yeah.
Steve. So-
it's adjustable, so
Okay.
one of John's favorite things.
Okay, VLT.
Okay, well, this one is relatively easy, and for me,
Solar fences one time.
this is one of my areas of expertise. So, anyway, the design team has specified they want high transparency between the window openings and the street. But the problem is, they didn't obviously have a technical expert on their team, because they picked values that are unattainable with low glazing. And we don't want to do, I mean, we have we have conflicts. If we implemented this, they wouldn't really be able to use any energy-efficient glass on the front of the building. They'd have to basically use non-energy efficient glass in the front of the building. So it's counterproductive to being energy to being, well, whatever you want to call it, forward-thinking, energy-conserving, green, whatever. And so all I was suggesting is that we change the value downward a little bit so that you could meet it with low-E glazings. And I show you technical values there. Clear glass with no low-E coatings would meet the value, but none of the glass that, say, PPG, one of the major manufacturers that has the largest range of low-E coatings, none of the glazings that they may make would meet the coating, would meet the design standard if they had a low-E coating on one of the glazings, which is counterproductive. It means that we would increase the heat loss or heat gain through the glass by about 30%, just like that.
What exactly are you, just, I don't understand this.
Okay.
You're proposing reducing the 80% value to 70%?
Right.
That seems almost counterintuitive in terms of, I would think the higher percentage would be more energy efficient, but apparently.
No, this is, yeah, there's a trade-off between, so regular glass, regular 2 layers of glass has a visual transparency of 0.82.
Okay.
Any kind of coating you put on the glass, even though it's transparent, like the low-E coatings that we have on it, tends to reduce the visible light transmittance a certain amount, no matter what.
Okay.
So each layer of glass reduces the visible light transmittance. So, so that the only, this would force a developer to choose a specific, there's a very limited number of low-E coatings that would still even make it at 0.7. They would have to choose on purpose very high visually transmissive coatings. It turns out the most energy efficient low-E coatings are the ones that have the most impact on visible light transmission. So, for example, the ones that they tend to use here can reduce light transmission down to 50 or 60%. 50% would probably be a pretty good number. There are some available that would only reduce it to 70% and give you 90% of this energy savings, not 93 or,
Okay.
Is that?
Let's hear Gabe respond.
I just point out for the group that the 80% standard applies to a very small amount of windows. In the overall context, what we're talking about is ground floor walls along the street, basically, and only 25% of that wall area. And of that 25%, 25% must be 80% VLT. So it's a very small amount of windows we're talking about. It's a minor change to go to 70% as suggested, not a non-issue really.
Pass.
I was just going to make the same comment. I guess I'll jump in and say that I think this whole section is written in a rather circular manner because it has requirements and then exemptions that refer back to previous requirements, and frankly I found it kind of confusing. But as I dove into it, well, where you've got windows or openings along street-facing ground floor walls at a 25%, and then you get down farther where windows in 3 are have to allow the VLT, but then you get down to 5 where dwelling units on the ground floor are exempt from 1 and 3. It just, to me, it kind of sends you back around in circles and it was a little confusing. I'm okay with the change we're proposing.
70?
To the 70, yeah. I don't think, again, it's such a small number, I think, but it's kind of a confusing section for me.
Okay. Steve?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. The way it's worded, it says at a minimum 25%. You might have a commercial building that has 100% of the street face all glass.
That's true.
Now we're restricting 25% of it to have this essentially not be able to use an energy-efficient glazing. It just doesn't make sense to me.
All right, well, let's put it on the table. Those in support of Steve's proposal, Rick?
Well, just, it seems to me, I don't know enough about this to feel like I'm making an appropriate decision for a code. I believe Steve is probably speaking it correctly. My suggestion would be go back, this would be one I'd throw back to the planning team and say, let's get an answer of this thing from a technical standpoint. I'm not the technical
I
guy.
understood Gabe to think that we might have done that already. Gabe,
No.
oh, you haven't, okay. John?
Well, I'm trying to figure out how this plays out. If we make this recommendation, it goes to staff. Won't the design team be able to elucidate their reason why our proposal wasn't a good idea?
They would.
So what is that, where does that?
What I'm saying is I'm comfortable with changing it, and if we really are dumb, we'll hear about it. The council will hear about it.
I just wanted I wanted to mention to people, then in a previous job, I worked for the Department of Energy for 15 years, and I developed the energy code, commercial energy code for the state of
So
Oregon.
you're responsible for this?
Well, I'm very,
that out in public?
unfortunately, I'm very familiar with this kind of technical information because this was what was required when we were developing the code, so.
Okay, well, let's see where the group goes with this then. Those who would be in favor of Steve's recommendation to propose reducing the 80% value to 70%, raise your hand. Okay, we're good to go there.
Well, that's a vote of confidence.
Self-defined
You
expert.
better not be wrong.
I gave you.
I wouldn't pursue it any further.
You won.
Don't try to find a piece of glass that works.
Hey, these are EWIM folks you're dealing with now, you know.
And these are the energy efficient people.
Yeah, don't tell me about that.
Careful, you're on record.
That's okay.
Let's move on to page 25. And Steve, yeah, and as I believe it's the final one, so, well, we've got an hour before Rick has to leave. so-
We're speeding right along today.
Steve, you want to tell us about your
Yeah.
proposal for setbacks?
This was one where I just wanted to mention this to the commissioners because I thought that this was there's a potential conflict in the setbacks here between bike commuters on the bicycle path and these boardwalk requirements, which require you to have which could lead to, bicycle pedestrian accidents. It seems to me that you might want to have some modest separation between the bike path and these hard surfaces that come out of the restaurant row.
Next page.
And right now, it's sort of, although it would be allowed, it's prohibited by the code language that we have here.
Gabe?
I mean, you might want to have plantings or something,
Yeah.
a small amount of separation, between the hardscape and the bicycle path itself.
Good suggestions. I would only point out that the definition of enhanced pedestrian area includes the allowance for landscaping, say, in large planters. We could be more explicit and actually prescribe a requirement for landscaping to a certain width, but I don't think it's precluded. And I think it's also important to point out that in the design guidelines for the park, there is a requirement for grade separation between the boardwalk and the bike path. So it's intentional to create that buffer or separation, if you will, between the bike traffic cruising through there pretty fast and the folks that are walking, say, amongst the shops. So it was intentional to both separate the grade and it does allow for some planter boxes, for example, on the boardwalk.
Other comments about this one? So there's grade separation.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Bill?
Well, and I'll jump in. I did look up the definition of enhanced pedestrian space, and that's correct. It does allow for a lot of different things, such as textured paving, planters connected to the earth, planting areas, kiosks, colonnades, drinking fountains, public art, etc. And so I think that, coupled with the grade separation, I'm comfortable leaving it as is.
John?
Well, I thought about how North Bank and Valley River Inn function now, and they do have separation, but they also have walls in between, but I'm comfortable that the code and the developer will be wise enough to make sure to avoid these conflicts.
Well, let's see where we are then with Steve's proposal to add some sort of a separation between the boardwalk and the bike path. So all those in favor of the changes Steve is proposing, raise your hand. Those satisfied with the code the way it is, raise your hand. And that, gentlemen, takes us to the conclusion of the code amendments. So what Bill and I talked with Gabe about is capturing all of the recommendations that we have discussed here. And obviously, we won't be able to recap those today, but Gabe's going to recite those and email them to us. And if there's anything that's wrong, need to notify Gabe and probably CC the rest of us. But pending that, what I'm going to suggest is that Bill go ahead and make a motion regarding this whole bundle and see where we go. John?
What about those votes that were 4-3? Are we going to ignore them or say that they lost by a small minority?
Do you have that recorded, Gabe?
I do.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with putting the vote count on this.
Okay.
We can do that.
Yeah, I think that would probably be a good idea.
I think for a few examples, I might need to go back to the webcast, but I can do that.
So they would be all the votes we had, no matter whether they prevailed or not?
I would suggest only where we make changes, or would only the changes and then show how close those were.
So a 4-3 would go forward showing the vote, but a
3-4
3-4 would not. I would think if it were as close as 3-4, that we ought to at least say we considered it and voted it down. Maybe not the 5-2s and the 6-1s or the 7-0s, but 3-4s, I think, are worth mentioning.
Any objection?
Probably only a couple anyway.
Okay, well, we can do that. 3-4, but not 2-5, not 1-6.
Everyone agrees.
Okay.
Should we vote on that, see if we're 3-4?
No. So, Bill, you want to propose the motion?
Sure. I move the Planning Commission recommend to City Council approval of the EWeb Metro Plan Amendment MA 12-1, Refinement Plan and related amendments RA 12-1, Code Amendments CA 12-4 with the modifications suggested by the Planning Commission in these deliberations, the zone change Z 12-6, and the Willamette Greenway permit WG 12-4. This motion is contingent upon a Planning Commission email review of a summary of the suggested changes prior to sending to Council.
Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? Well, I would just say a significant amount of appreciation to the citizen advisory team, the consultants, the landscape architects and architects, the EWeb and city staff that put this together. Again, as I mentioned before, based on the way Portland and Salem and Corvallis have all improved their riverfront areas, this is a terrific step in that direction. It also, I think, addresses many of the envisioned Eugene goals, and the sooner that we can get on with it, as far as I'm concerned, the better. So I'm strongly in favor of it.
No comment.
Any other comments? All in favor of the motion, then raise your hand. Opposed? Carries unanimously. Thank you all very much. Items from commission and staff.
Just before the meeting, I did forward you notes from our retreat, so I would appreciate it if you check those out to see if there's any corrections or anything to add, and we'll move on.
Members of the commission, our next meeting is a week from today, March 18th. This meeting is adjourned.